Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We're just going to wait for a couple of moments just for everyone to register. Three of us on the webinar have got building work going on in the background, so we are going to do our absolute best to get through this. You can probably hear it with me at the moment, so whoever's not on mute is entirely guilty of that. Okay, lots of people coming through, which is great. So we're just going to give it a couple more. Okay, numbers are stabilized, and let's start the webinar. So first of all, a very warm welcome for all of us here at Jones Chase, and we're delighted to have you with us on our Opening Up Employment webinar, which is quite ironic. We planned this a number of weeks ago, but the government obviously changed the plans on Monday. You can't really make that up, but ultimately the government said they're very confident that on the 19th of July, things really should start opening up. So we all think it's a good thing to do this anyway. Inevitably, we will get back to at least some form of attendance in the office. And there's some other really fantastic topics that are going to be covered today. So all very topical, all very useful, hopefully. And once again, we're delighted to have you with us. So for those of you that are new to the webinars, and there are some new people here today, just to introduce the team. So we've got Shona, one of the firm's partners.
Hello, good afternoon.
And going clockwise, Harriet, one of the firm's associates.
Hi, everybody.
Senior associates, sorry, my bad. And Katie, one of the firm's associates.
Hello, everyone.
And that's the first time I've said that on this webinar. I actually qualified this month. That's great. Okay, in terms of the format for the webinar, we will run through, obviously we'll run through some legal updates. And if you want to ask us questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A box. If you want to do this anonymously, please do hit the anonymized or anonymous button. Otherwise, you can use the chat function, but your name will be displayed to everyone. So just to keep an eye on that. If you want to speak live, please write this in the Q&A box or the chat box, and either myself or one of the others will unmute you so you can speak live on the webinar. I should add that we are recording the webinar, and that allows us to distribute this to those clients and contacts of ours that couldn't make it at 4 o'clock today. So please bear that in mind if you want to ask questions and you're not doing so on an anonymized basis. I should add that the points that we're covering today, they're not formal legal advice, and so much depends on the facts of each individual case. And very often the approach that you take in one case isn't commercially or legally relevant in another. If you do not rely on this webinar for legal advice, and if you do want to steer on something or need some help, definitely drop us a line. We'll be delighted to help you. Another quick reminder that the information we're covering today is accurate as at 4 o'clock on the 17th of June. Things are changing very quickly, obviously, and do drop us a line if you have any questions about what we're covering. Everyone's time is precious, so we will finish at 5 o'clock today at the latest, if not before. And lastly, we do helping people, companies and individuals. So if you know of anybody else that would find these webinars or bulletins useful or need employment legal advice, we'd be delighted to help them. So please feel free to share our contact details. And yes, as a quick reminder, we do act for individuals too. It's a big part of our practice. And yeah, we're more than happy to help individual clients as well as companies. So moving very quickly on to the topics. The first topic that we're going to cover today is the inevitable return to the workplace, and the rules regarding this have been a movable feast over the last 12 months, certainly. So Harry's here to provide you with a very timely reminder of what the current state of play is. So over to you, Harriet.
Thank you, Dean. And I think, as Dean said, and given we've not had the opening up, we're not going to be looking at an immediate return potentially, but we've got this potential date of the 19th of July. So for now, the current restrictions remain in place, and this includes the advice to work from home if you can, but obviously if the job can't be done from home, people can travel to the workplace. So we're looking at the 19th of July at the earliest in terms of the advice for people to be going back to the office. But obviously businesses will be thinking now and planning for what the working arrangements are going to be in hopefully the near future. Given that many office staff will have been working from home where possible since March 2020, remote working really has become the norm for most office workers. And I think lots of companies we're seeing have already said they expect to have a mixture of staff in the office and at home. And obviously this is partly because I think the pandemic has shown that home working can be effective, but also many organisations have been shutting offices or reducing office space to save money. So given we've now got this date of the 19th of July, can you just require all staff who are contractually required to work at the office to return once the guidance has been lifted? And I think in simple terms, the answer is technically yes, but I think there are a number of issues and potential pitfalls to think through before just requiring people to return. And obviously we're all dealing with employees, with people, and nobody is going to necessarily react in the same way. So I don't think we should expect everyone to just be willing to come back to work just like that and pick up where we all left off. I think there's going to be a real need to consult, provide information, get people ready, deal with any potential sort of concerns or issues sort of well in advance of that. And obviously we've now got a few more weeks to look at all of that. I first wanted to look at what employer and employees' attitudes seem to be at the current time about returning to the office versus home working. And I came across a survey that was published on Monday by the Office for National Statistics, which seems to show that employees are keener than businesses on long-term home working. And I'm just going to give you a few sort of facts and figures from the survey because I thought it was quite interesting. It found that 60% of individuals, so that's the employees, thought they'd go back to their usual place of work over the next 5 months. Just over a third of workers between the ages of 16 and 29 expect to return in the next 2 months, so that's a bit sooner, compared with less than 30% of all other age groups. So it seems the younger people think that they may be going back a bit. Of the working adults who are currently working from home, 85% wanted to use a hybrid approach of both home and office working in the future. And interestingly, workers with higher incomes were more likely to expect a hybrid model. 93% of those earning more than 50,000 expected this, and 90% of those earning between 40 and 50,000. Those workers earning a lot less money expect to be in the usual place of work. So there seems to be quite a high expectation on the part of employees, certainly, that they are going to have some kind of choice about whether they work from home or not. Looking at businesses' attitude, only a quarter of businesses have already decided to use increased home working as a permanent model, and that was a separate study conducted in late April. And the main reason seemed to be to improve staff well-being, but I think cost cutting is a stronger motivation probably for smaller businesses. And almost 2/5 of businesses expected to see at least 75% of their staff to be at their normal workplace on any given day going forward. And a similar proportion expected their workforce to return to their normal place of work within the next 3 months. So there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect there between what businesses might be expecting and what employees might be expecting. So I think that's obviously a message to make sure that your communication is really clear, which I'll come on to. Interestingly, the survey cited that disadvantages of home working, most cited by employees, were a lack of job opportunities and feeling it was harder to collaborate with colleagues. And I'm going to come back in a little while to these potential issues that can arise with people working from home more long term. And I think that we've also seen in the press very recently that quite large employers, a few of the investment banks, some of the tech giants, Apple and Google, have recently reversed pandemic working conditions, and they're saying to staff, we expect you to return to the office in the next few months. As I say, there's quite a variety of views there. One attendee asked us in advance of the webinar, from when will most employers be insisting on a proportion of the week being worked in the office? And I thought it might be nice if you wouldn't mind sharing what your organisation is doing or what you think it might be doing in the chat function. And then I'll come back to that at the end of my section and we can share what you're all planning or your organisation is planning to do in terms of when people might be starting to go back to the office. It might be quite interesting. So I think it's clear there's going to be many varying views from employees and employers on coming back to the office. This sort of hybrid working seems to be quite a popular option. So that could be 2 days at home, 2 days in the office, or 3 days in the office, however it might be. And I think, as I say, it's important that employers do communicate with employees as early as possible to ensure a smooth return. And employers will be wanting to think about getting feedback from employees. It may be that many of you have already done this. Make the employees feel involved, and hopefully this should reassure them and encourage their buy-in to the arrangements. So you need to remember that if all your office-based staff have been working from home, they've been doing this for over a year now. So it's a big change for people, and we would advise employees to adopt an open, supportive, flexible approach to coming back to the office. And I think giving people reasonable notice is important, because if people have been working from home for this long, they may have changed their arrangements. For example, the time they pick up their children from childcare because they don't have to commute, that might be different. So people may have personal arrangements that they're going to need to change. Now, I just wanted to look a little bit about hybrid working, and if you have, going forward, you're going to have some people working from home, some people in the office. Is there a danger of creating a two-tier system? People have been talking about this a bit. So those who work more from home, may they be disadvantaged compared with those who are in the office if this is an ongoing arrangement? Issues of indirect discrimination could potentially arise because of, for example, disability or sex if employees with those characteristics might be more likely to opt for homework. It could be that management end up giving preferential treatment to those who are in the office on a regular basis, as they may be more visible, and there may be arguments that those in the office have had preferential allocation of good assignments or pay increases or promotion. And I mention this because Susanna, who's not with us today, but she shared that she saw in another webinar a report on hybrid working that's from the LSE, using behavioural science to promote inclusion in the workplace. And they've put together a dictionary of behavioural biases. And we're happy to send this round after the webinar if people are interested. But it really looks at how the world of work is changing and what is going to become the new normal. I don't like that phrase, but it's, you know, seems to fit the bill. And as I've said, this move towards hybrid working, I think, can really pose challenges for inclusivity, and considering how people may behave differently if they're in the office or working remotely, and trying to preempt those issues and effectively manage them. And this report may really help the current discussions that are going on in businesses who are looking to reorganise their work. And just some quick examples of what they're talking about. Things like remote workers may not be as involved in discussions and meetings which take place in the office. They may not feel up to speed with projects, they may not be updated. Those working from home may become disengaged. The report talks about the can't be bothered effect, which I quite liked. They may stop providing their inputs, they don't feel valued. They miss out on informal discussions on topics in the office. It may lead to detachment, especially if you've had new hires who have only ever worked from home and they carry on working from home predominantly. So it's about how to integrate them. And those working from home, their behaviour may change to try and get noticed, or they may feel they have to prove their worth. And all of this, I think, can create issues with colleagues that may mean that people work less collaboratively. And interestingly, that was one of the main reasons that was cited in the study for disadvantages that people see from potentially working from home: less collaboration. And you may see splits between those who are mainly in the office and those who are mainly at home, because obviously some jobs can't be done from home. So you may have in your organisation some people who will always be in the office because of the type of work they do, and potentially others who can work from home and have a mixture. And I think that sometimes the grass is always greener. Those who are in the office may think that those who are at home are having a lovely time swanning about and not doing very much. So it's a question of communicating with everybody so that everybody knows what they're doing. And I think a lot of these issues can obviously impact staff well-being, reduce feelings of belonging, leading to dissatisfaction, lower levels of attachment to their employer and its goals. And also we talked in a recent webinar about workplace conflict. And I think this is a real example of how organisations may want to try and get ahead of the curve and preempt some of these issues that might happen as the culture changes, because people aren't perhaps in the workplace as much. So I think if you are looking at taking on this kind of hybrid model, think about these things and think about the steps that you can take to really ensure the inclusion of your people who are working from home. And the communication is important. Build this into any policies you're creating to deal with hybrid working or working from home. And just in terms of policies, I think it's important to make sure that they're really clear. I would probably advise against having informal arrangements about saying work from home when you like, potentially, because if the employee thinks that they don't have to come in, and then the employer says we need you to come in on any given day, and the employee says, well, I don't think that I have to because you told me I didn't have to, it could potentially lead to misunderstandings and disputes. So I think to be really clear what your policy is and how it applies to everybody and when they are expected to come into the office. And then just lastly, I wanted to look at reassurance to those returning. So how are you going to be reassuring those that are coming back? Some employees are naturally going to be nervous about a return to the office. People's views vary widely. I think just from talking to my own friends about how they feel about coming back to the office, some people have no concerns at all, raring to go. Others are really reluctant and very worried about it. So I think we have to bear that in mind with your workforce. Clear communication, clear dialogue. Always try to avoid forcing people to do something they don't want to do. But if people have particular concerns, we'd always advise that you deal with this on a case-by-case basis and consult with employees so you can really get to the bottom of what they're worried about and see how that can be overcome, rather than just going down the route of Goldman Sachs and saying everybody's back to the office, we're not going to discuss it. So I think rigorous health and safety audits, risk management, collaborating with staff groups, whether they are trade unions, employee forums, and explain the steps that you've taken and how, depending on what the advice is at the time that your staff are coming back to work, making sure you're explaining how you are adhering to that. And I think in terms of how you communicate things, just bear in mind that when you're communicating with staff about coming back to the office, they're not all in the office with their colleagues around them to talk about messages from management as they would have been pre-pandemic. So, for example, sending a long email setting out how it's all going to work may not be the best way to communicate with staff. So you might want to think about changing your usual way of communicating, the timing, the pace as it may be, and maybe, for example, using a video rather than an email to communicate this message. You could show staff the office environment, which may help people feel more comfortable to actually see it. So I think can be about how you say things and the sharing of information. So that's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to look now at the chat function. I think we've got a few replies in terms of how when people may be coming back to the office. So we've got Brian said, expect some back ASAP after the restrictions are lifted, but no firm details. So hopefully, some back as soon as from the 19th of July, potentially. Sharon said, we plan to return in September due to the latest announcements, although colleagues can go in now from a wellbeing perspective, but only for a few days a week. Okay. Sam has said, gradual return for volunteers, April to August. Daily numbers capped to ensure social distancing from September. Expecting a return 2 days a week, moving to 3 days from October, assuming social distancing measures are lifted. If not, we'll need to rethink. It's a trial. And then Sharon's also said we're going to trial hybrid working for the majority of our colleagues. We can't for all colleagues, as some customers dictate 5 days a week office working. Yeah, and that's a question of looking at how it's going to differ depending on what somebody's role is and dealing with that. Rebecca said colleagues can go in now if it's essential, a gradual return in July with cap numbers. And Sam said coming back part-time is the plan in July, limits on numbers for health and safety reasons. Thank you so much for those of you who've given their views. That's really interesting to see, but it looks like a bit now, but still waiting a little while, maybe till September for a return for more people. That's really helpful. Thank you so much. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Dean, just before we move on, I just wondered about the contractual side of things, because a lot of employees will have in their contract of employment their place of work is the company's offices at blah, blah, blah. And maybe in March 2020, that place of work might have not been changed in the contract, might have been changed temporarily, maybe was changed permanently somewhere throughout the year. I just wondered, Harriet, what you thought in terms of almost be careful what you wish for as an employee, because you may want some kind of permanent change to recognise a hybrid working or a different place of work or something. And then 6 months down the line, think, oh my goodness, I feel a little left out here. I'd quite like to go back in. And here you are now sitting with a contract that's saying 3 days here and 2 days there.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think some people may believe or understand that they have a completely free choice. So it may be they think, oh, that's great. I've got the option to stay at home for a few days, come into the office for a few days, and think it's completely flexible and that they can then change their mind at any point. I think, again, I think that comes back down to communication, does it, within the organisation, to say, potentially we're going to give you the option if you want to now have a hybrid working arrangement where you are at home for a number of days or in the office for a number of days. We're happy to agree to that, but that will, if this is what the organisation is doing, this will be a permanent contractual change to your terms and conditions. And here's the amendment letter, sign here. I think, as mentioned in the chat function, some organisations are going to trial hybrid working arrangements, which might be a really good way to do it, to avoid that situation where people have agreed to something that they then later regret, and then having to unpick that and having employees feeling dissatisfied. Because I think it is a sort of brave new world, isn't it? Nobody really knows how that kind of hybrid working arrangement is going to work once everybody's back in the office. When we've all been in the same boat and we've all been working from home, that's been one thing, but there's been nobody else really in the office to say, oh, look, all your mates are in the office having a nice time together. So I think, yeah, absolutely. If a business can cope with having a trial arrangement, great. If not, I think it's clear communication to employees to make sure that this is what they really want to do, and it will be a permanent contractual change.
In that Office for National Statistics thing as well, I think they were suggesting that the majority of people who wanted to remain at home were female, and so there could be a disparate situation with gender bias, particularly with all individuals, if it does leave you feeling left out, or you don't get in on those top projects, or whatever it is that happens as a result of the workplace. So yeah, I agree with you. Probably that suck it and see might be the best way for everyone, employer and employee.
Yeah, and I just noticed So I think
Harriet, sorry, I've been letting you guys chat. Just a really important announcement to everybody. With the chat function, right at the bottom before you comment, there should be an option to hit, instead of all panelists and attendees. So if you want to comment so everybody on the webinar can see what you're saying, then just, it kind of helps us so we don't have to, I mean, we will read them out anyway, because for the purposes of the webinar recording. But if you want to comment so everybody can see what you're saying, then hit all panelists and employee attendees, not employees, Freudian, on the drop-down box. Okay, sorry, Harriet. I'll
thank you. I was just going to share what Sam has said. So just share that I'm coming back part-time is a plan. I think I did that now. So following on from Shane's comments, I'm concerned about health and safety, insurance and the tax impact of hybrid working. Yeah, good point. And can we have the link for the ONS survey, please? Yes, so we can send that round. We can share the hybrid working report from the LSE and the survey. So yeah, that's no problem.
Okay, fantastic. Just a couple of very quick things for me as well before we move on to the next section. You're absolutely right about getting the contractual situation, not looking after that. You've got a disparity between what the contract or policy is saying, what's happening in practice. That can lead to a real mess. Obviously, we can help you with that. We're doing it for multiple clients at the moment. So if anybody needs a hand with getting the documents in place, it should really help in the long term if you need to undo things, change things, or just to get your house in order. Something else I think is due to the inevitable blend of employment and health and safety issues arising here. If the workplace is not COVID secure at the moment, and then employers are requiring everyone to go back, you could get a surge in grievances, whistleblowing complaints, and also health and safety complaints under the Employment Rights Act as well. So there's some really nasty automatic unfair dismissal issues can arise. Whistleblowing has uncapped damages as well. And you could have a snowball effect. If one person does it, then other people could jump on the bandwagon. So you've got to get on top of your own health and safety situation, but you've got to be slightly careful about getting people back to work. Because Harry, you're right, employers can require people to come back to work, but it's all about just making sure that your house is in order before you do so, with communications and contracts and everything. Great.
Actually, Dean, just on that health and safety thing, which is a good point to make. I read somewhere that these plastic separators that people are putting in, apparently because they could prevent the smooth ventilation circulation within a room, that they in fact could be worse rather than better for individuals. So that health and safety thing, just as you have said in terms of the employment and returning to work, it's a forever moving feast. You have to keep your eye on what is the latest advice from each expert at each level. Yes, I agree with you about keep up to date.
That's great. Okay, thanks, Harry. Sure enough, that's fantastic. We're going to move on to, time is flying by as ever with these webinars. So we're going to move on to, yes, just to clarify, the question that Harry answered during her section was from Louise. So thanks for submitting that prior to the webinar, Louise. Moving on to Katie's section. So we had another question in the last webinar that we did from Samantha, and she was asking us how we would manage holidays in light of the government's new traffic light travel system. And without further ado, over to you, Katie, to deal with that.
Great, thanks, Dean. So I was just going to quickly recap. I'm sure you're all well aware, but since the 18th of January, individuals have needed to quarantine for 10 days unless arriving from Ireland, Channel Islands or the Isle of Man. And then subsequently, there was the requirement to spend a 10-day period in a quarantine hotel, which was introduced for the red list countries, so countries banned in the UK. And then from the 17th of May, red, amber and green list rules apply when entering England from overseas, imposing 3 different levels of quarantine obligations depending on the country the employee is visited. So green, no quarantine, quarantine for 10 days, and red, a hotel quarantine. So we were asked by Sam before the webinar to conduct a poll, much like Harriet did with the working arrangements, to see what you are all doing in light of the new traffic light system in respect of holidays. So how's your business managing this? So for those of you who'd like to comment in the chat, that would be really helpful. We can have a little look a little later on about what everyone is thinking about doing to manage this. But I will carry on with a bit of our guidance about what we would suggest. So I was having major deja vu covering this topic because I also covered it last summer as we came out of lockdown. And unfortunately, it's pretty much the same and there's still no clear guidance on what you can do, and especially no clear guidance on what pay an employee is entitled to if they're quarantined on return from a holiday abroad. So I think it'd just be helpful to set out at the start. I'm going to cover leisure holidays, so I think it would be very different circumstances and situation if you have an employee going away to a red, amber or green country for emergency reasons. So just holidays. First of all, can an employer restrict employees travelling during non-working time? So the simple answer is no, but you can attempt to discourage it. You might consider, perhaps by way of a policy, instructing employees not to travel to countries on the red and amber list in England, which the government advises not to travel for leisure purposes. This is, however, quite questionable because whether this would be a reasonable management instruction, given that it seeks to dictate what an employee can do with their leisure time rather than how to do their job. So you also need to be aware of issuing a policy with directions of what employees can or do, or what they might be paid following a return from non-work related travel, as this might be indirectly discriminatory. For example, if you attempt to restrict travel to certain countries, employees who are nationals of those countries could potentially claim indirect discrimination on the basis that your policy disproportionately affects them. It's likely that you will have a good defence to any such claim as your behaviour and policy is a proportionate means. However, this will come down to who you're trying to restrict and why. So if you're trying to restrict employees that can work from home and such, that probably isn't proportionate. So even where you attempt to impose new travel restrictions of this sort, it is questionable whether an employee commits a disciplinary offence in contravening it, given that, like I said, it's unlikely to be regarded as reasonable to restrict employees' leisure activities. A more proportionate response, bearing in mind the discrimination issues mentioned before, might be to consider advising your workforce by way of a policy that anyone who does travel overseas and is subject to quarantine will not be entitled to contractual pay, including contractual sick pay, unless they are able to work from their place of quarantine. However, I would suggest that if a scenario did arise where an employee had to quarantine and they could not work from quarantine, that you would need to consider whether withholding pay would amount to a breach of contract or a unilateral change in terms and conditions. The issue being that if employees agree to take unpaid leave, then that's great. But if they do not, then it's not so straightforward. Arguably, on the one hand, an employee who is not able to work the implied rights to be paid isn't enacted and it would not apply. However, it might be arguable from an employee's perspective that where the employee is subject to a restriction of this sort, their ability to work is not affected. And there has been some case law, and it's all pre-COVID, it's not relating to a COVID circumstance, but it suggests that if an employee is ready and willing to work and the inability to work is a result of a third-party decision or external constraint, then any deduction may be unlawful depending on the circumstances. So therefore, an involuntary inability to work or one resulting from an unavoidable impediment may render the deduction of pay unlawful. So an employee therefore might argue that the government restrictions mean their inability to work is involuntary, external, unavoidable. However, if the overseas trip was booked with the knowledge that there would be a period of self-isolation, then it may be more difficult to succeed in this argument, and that the isolation was caused by an external factor out of their control. But in light of that, you might decide to implement a policy that states that any employee who travels overseas will need to use their annual leave during any period of quarantine on the basis that any such absence will otherwise be regarded as unauthorised. This may have the actual desired effect of just discouraging employees from the get-go of even going abroad if they've got to use annual leave for an additional, what will probably be 2 weeks. But again, this will only be applied to employees who cannot work from their place of quarantine. Previously, there was a question mark actually over whether employers could force employees to take their statutory annual leave, because this would affect, they'd be confined to their house, and there was questions over whether this would satisfy the rest and relaxation purpose of the annual leave under the Working Time Directive. However, in August last year, the government did publish some very brief, not particularly helpful guidance, but it did suggest that where possible, employees should work from home during their self-isolation and should talk to their employers about this before they travel. But it did confirm that employees could take leave to cover the period of post-travel quarantine if they had enough leave remaining, and confirms that an employer could require an employee to take leave during any such period if the correct notice was given under the working time regulations. So this is where you need to have a policy in place which informs employees that any quarantine period where they cannot work is annual leave. One idea I thought of is you might consider implementing a holiday policy for those who do not have sufficient holiday accrued or left. So rather than an employee being on unpaid leave, which, as I've said, is questionable, they'd have to agree, they actually have to buy more holiday to cover a period of quarantine. So I might be being a bit cheeky there because it's pretty much the same thing, but it's just a thought. The guidance also states that dismissal should be a last resort and policies should consider employers should consider alternative arrangements first, such as what I've already discussed, so agreeing with employees to take annual leave or unpaid leave. And where possible, employers should explore options for employees to work from home or agree to work that can be completed from home. Unfortunately, as yet, there is no guidance on whether an employee will be entitled to statutory sick pay for the period spent in quarantine, but it would seem very unlikely. So just to recap, our suggestion is that you put a policy in place which makes clear to employees that if they're quarantined on arrival from red or amber countries and cannot work from quarantine destination, then they will need to take annual leave to cover this period, or agree to unpaid leave if they do not have the requisite accrual, or my suggestion of a buy holiday scheme. This actually really is with the hope that you might just deter employees from even going to red or amber countries in the first place. But if you can't do that, then quarantine could be annual leave. You may also want to consider including in your policy your views on your staff taking their work phones and laptops abroad with them, which would allow them to work from hotel quarantine. So it depends on whether you're happy for all of your devices and on a GDPR perspective to be travelling around the world, or whether you would like to restrict that and people take annual leave rather than working from hotel quarantine. So we've also had a question in from Francis who's asked, what would you advise we do when we have office staff who can work from home for their quarantine period and pack house staff who cannot and therefore feel penalised if they go abroad and have to take unpaid leave for this quarantine period? So in our view, this is unfortunately just the way it is, and it's perhaps what you can say to employees is it's a matter of public policy. So the government has imposed a quarantine period and it's deciding who should pay for this quarantine period, and the government aren't going to pay for it, and then you probably don't want to pay for it, and therefore it's going to be the employee that has to pay for it through annual leave or unpaid leave. And at present it is the employee's risk. So much like sick pay is available, and it often this is statutory for employees who are isolated because they've been track and traced, they're more penalised than those who can simply work from home if they've been track and traced. On the HR side, and trying to keep your employees on side, you can just remind them that it's not favouritism, it's not prejudice, it's just because of the current public policy, and employees can still have holidays even if they can't go abroad. And it's much like the ever increasingly likelihood that we're going to have vaccination passports and be able to travel freely if you've been fully vaccinated is rising the young, but it's just we're all doing our bit and we are just all at the peril of the guidance. So one member of the team did suggest that you might consider allowing those who cannot work from home to carry over more holiday to next year, but it might be easier to go abroad as another way to try and appease your employees. I'm not sure I love this idea because I actually think a lot of your employees that can work from home will not want to go away this year. Either they might not feel safe abroad, or they too don't want to take the risk that they'll be quarantined or for 10 days, even if they can work. So you might end up just really annoying your people that can work from home who would also like to carry over holiday to next year and go abroad next year. So that's everything I've got to say, but I think we've had a couple of people in the chat saying what they might do for
yeah, while you're reading that, Katie, do you remember Harriet said in your talk, Harriet, in your Office for National Statistics, that the breakdown in salary and the working from home correlation, and the higher the salary, the greater I want to work from home, and the lower the salary, maybe not cross their minds. And so whilst there isn't a prejudice and there's no protection and discrimination for class and or education and the provision of education, this is just all coming round again for the sickness element as well, and or quarantine pay, where you lose out if you're in that job that requires you to go into work, maybe in a factory setting or packing situation as the question person.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. So we haven't actually had anyone saying what we're going to do in terms of managing holidays, which is probably fair because I've gone on to say what we think you should do, so it might just be calling people out for doing what we think is the wrong thing. But we have had one attendee has said, as we're still working from home, staff are asked to travel with laptops, and if they get stuck overseas, providing they can still work, they don't need to take leave if they have to quarantine. So no problem. We are working from home, so no impact. So yeah, that's helpful. That's one option, is everyone traveling with their devices. That's everything I have to say on that topic.
That's great, Katie, and thanks for covering a very difficult subject very eloquently. Thank you for that. That's great. 21 minutes left, so we're going to move very quickly on to Shona's section. We've had no new comments in today, or sections, I should say. She's covering 2 topics. So Shona's going to speak to everybody about the current employment or response to the rise of technology in our working lives. Ironically, we're all on Zoom right now. And secondly, the right to disconnect. And should employers be responsible for ensuring that employees have a good work-life balance? So over to you, Shona.
Okay, thank you, Dean. I also have 2 scaffolders outside erecting scaffolding to our neighbours' properties. So there might be a bit of a in the background, so I apologise in advance. That might be just me because I'm having to cover technology, because I made some slides for this because I wanted to get the definitions correct in what we perceive to be the influx of technology within the workplace. And the 2 main things at the moment are artificial intelligence and automated decision making. So in the first, this is the definition that we currently have under English and the law of England and Wales for artificial intelligence. This is machines might be able to work in the same way as humans, except faster, more consistently and more often. And artificial intelligence under the Enterprise Act, and see the date of that act, this is 2002, so nearly 20 years ago. They were defining artificial intelligence as technology enabling the programming or training of a device or software to use or process external data independent of any further input or programming, to carry out or undertake with a view to achieving complex specific tasks, automated data analysis or automated decision making, or analogous processing and use of data or information. So how in the last 20 years that's developed actually in the world is, for instance, face recognition when you go through the passport control, or you turn up at Tesco's and you've got your automatic processing with the till, and it calculates everything on whether you've got your own bag or you haven't got your own bag. AI has moved on dramatically in providing this automated system in order that we can live our lives in what they think is a faster, consistent, and the machines work more often than we do. So the Enterprise Act is 2002. There's currently another draft definition for artificial intelligence being considered, but it has not been interpreted in law yet. And so this is what we are left with as described. And one of the things that crops up in employment is this automated data analysis used for processing the use of data or information to make decisions. And automated decision making, this ADM, is what's being used in employment throughout our entire employment careers. So from recruitment through to termination. So if we look at automated decision making, this is when we've got AI, we've got an algorithm, and that algorithm is given artificial intelligence to make decisions on our behalf with limited human interaction. If we could move to the next slide, Dean, to see what says with artificial intelligence. This is mostly to do with profiling, where the automated profiling of your data goes into a computer and comes out with answers automatically in order to decide whether that person is right for the job, whether that person is trustworthy, or as at the end there it says whether the person's likely to be a reliable employee. And with those of us with children in their 20s, lots of jobs, temporary jobs in retail, etc., are being recruited for using artificial intelligence and this profiling system, where their information, their data is all done online. They apply for the job and they go through each state online for the provision of that job, the application for the job. So that's what's known as profiling, and analysing what is being said in the form completed in order to decide whether that person's fit for that job. So the next slide then, Dean. Thank you. So this was used by Deliveroo in Italy, and I've already got my job now. I'm in employment, and how am I going to get work allocated to me? And this Deliveroo case is a great example. They used an app to prioritise jobs for the riders within Deliveroo. And if you took on a job, you got a better score, and because you were more thought of as being more reliable and more flexible, particularly if you took on jobs at the busiest times. And this meant that allocated, the more jobs you took on, the more jobs you got. And the data generated was based on this willingness of the riders. And the case was brought because it was decided that this was against female employees because they would have childcare issues that meant that they couldn't be quite as reliable or quite as able to take on work at the busiest times because they had childcare responsibilities. So the app that was used by Deliveroo, you could understand why they wanted to ascertain who was the most reliable, who was the most flexible, in order to then generate more work for those people. But it turned out that this automated system, this profiling that it resulted with was discriminatory on part of the organisation. Now, in this instance, you'll see that the Italian case is in blue at the start of the slide. The claim was brought against Deliveroo itself. And one of the arguments that can be had, and is being had with artificial intelligence, is who is the correct respondent, who is the correct person against whom you're going to bring your claim? Because Deliveroo will say, we use this app and that was provided to us by X Limited, who created an app at our instruction, but we didn't intend it to be discriminatory. And therefore it could be that the correct respondent is the artificial intelligence program organization, because they have created something that has resulted inadvertently in discriminatory impact. So again, it's who, I would suggest probably under English law, the correct arrangement would be the employee would bring their discrimination claim against the employee. There's an inadvertent discriminatory act, but is it justified or not? And that employer would then have an ongoing commercial arrangement with the artificial intelligence company that created the app for them in the first place. And in that agreement, is there an indemnity in that agreement between the two commercial companies that covers the employment issue that's arisen with Deliveroo? So you have to think both with an employment hat on and your commercial hat as to what agreement you've reached with that artificial intelligence. Dean, the next slide. Thank you. So I mentioned at the outset that this is an employment relationship for every stage. The recruitment, it's the forms completed, the interviews attended. In some instances, our children have been attending interviews with a computer. There is no human being at the other side that they're answering the questions to, and their answers generate a different question going through a system to try and sift out those that they don't want. We know that it generates different questions because we've had a couple of them trying it at the same time, and they get different questions as a result of what they've said in response to one. Assessment centres are being held without humans being involved. Again, it's interaction. The other humans will be the other applicants for that role, but no human from the organisation to which the individuals apply. And this leads to this machine sifting of applicants down to the decision then as who to hire. Starting employment, a lot of onboarding is done by artificial intelligence, where you collate all the information, and as a result of that, you're sent a package of a chair or whatever it is that's needed for the job that you've applied for, and details of onboarding, again, without the human interaction. And then whilst at work, one of the most important elements is this tracking of performance, the hours you're working, the quality of the work that you've done, and the time that you're online and client facing. That can all be monitored by the employer and fed back to the employee in relation to performance and maybe bonus related, etc. So that tracking of performance is the during employment. It can also be the tracking of attendance as well. And then on the ending of employment, there is currently a case going through the tribunal system where individuals were dismissed through artificial intelligence provision, and no human was involved in that dismissal exercise. I'm not sure how evidence is going to be produced at the tribunal by the computer that made the decision in the end, but no doubt it's the algorithm that led to that decision for those individuals not to be kept on in employment. That's a case that's due to be heard in 2022. It sounds futuristic. It sounds, I don't know if anyone watches Black Box, but it sounds like an episode of Black Box. And one of the elements of this artificial intelligence is exactly that. The black box that is controlling the decisions that are being made through the data that's generated. And it's the lack of transparency with that black box and knowing what it is that's been applied as an algorithm that's ended up either you're not being recruited, or you're not being promoted, or your performance being considered as bad, or indeed dismissal. And it's that lack of transparency, which is slightly ironic in this day and age, bearing in mind that transparency is what everybody suggests ought to be everyone's right with the GDPR implications. So that's the AI, and it's one of those topics that this is for the future. Look out for it in the future. So the next slide, Dean, is then to do with the right to disconnect. And is there one? And the reason that we put this in the talk this week in the webinar is because of how it's covered all the working from home and the opening up and what the general consensus is about preference for working from home. But the working from home can lead to working longer hours, but more difficult hours where you don't turn off. We wanted to cover this right to disconnect, to just challenge whether the individual employee has that right or not, and if they do, under what legislation. So this is, I'm referring to a piece of legislation that goes back to 1998 and John Major, who introduced the working time regulations as a result of a European directive. These working time regulations applied throughout Europe, and the UK negotiated at the time through John Major an opt-out clause. And that opt-out clause was to say that in the UK, we don't want to be limited in a working week, and therefore there ought to be a right to opt out of the 48-hour working week that was being imposed under the working time regulations. And the UK was given that right to opt out, and many of you will have opt-out agreements in your contracts where the employees have opted out of that 48 hours. It usually affects the very senior and the very junior or manual workers. Very senior because they have to work every hour of the day to keep businesses running, and the more junior or manual because actually it impacts overtime, and you could limit your ability to earn overtime, and some people rely upon that in order for their bank account to be at the right level. So those working time regulations have this opt-out agreement in it for the 48 hours. And that went through to 2005. And in 2005, the UK had to go back to extend that right to opt-out. And at the time, many people wanted to vote against it and go back to a definite 48 hours. But the opt-out was retained. The UK were allowed to keep it in Europe. And now that we're out of Europe, it doesn't matter what Europe think. The 48-hour plus working week is part of our legislation. So that puts in the maximum working week. And then do we have then a right to disconnect after that 48-hour period? Not necessarily so, because we've still got the ability to communicate digitally, etc. And I've just mentioned there about instant messaging, emails, mobile phones, all allow us to be connected at any point in the day. And then it's this right to step away. In France, if we go to the next slide, Dean, thank you. In France, I mentioned the 48-hour week and the European legislation and how we transposed that into the UK. In France, they transposed the working time, the European legislation, into a 35-hour week. So France has a 35-hour working week. The UK is 48 and can opt out. France has 35 hours. And then in 2017, pre-pandemic, the French Labour Code said, in addition to that 35-hour week, there is a right to disconnect. So companies with more than 50 employees are required to recognise and negotiate with employees the policy to control the use of digital tools, including this right to disconnect. The French have it. The Italians, later on in 2017, they implemented also the fact that there should be an agreement within organisations for this right to disconnect. Spain followed in 2018, and then Luxembourg, Netherlands and Germany, they're currently debating the point. So what about the UK, Dean? Next slide. We've got, what about us? What are we doing? So the UK and Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland in April this year, and this is in response to the pandemic, it's produced a code that employers have a policy in place which confirms that employees have a right not to have to work outside of normal hours, and employers and colleagues should not routinely email or call outside of those times. Employees also cannot be penalised for refusing to work during non-working hours. but there's no specific redress as yet. Now, this is part of it. This is not a legally binding obligation that has teeth. And by teeth, if your employer doesn't do this in the Republic of Ireland, there's no right of redress. There's no compensation that you'll be paid if you bring a claim to say, hold on a minute, I don't have this right to disconnect. But also, this code includes this phrase, have the right not to have to work outside of normal hours. And it's what's meant by normal hours. For many employers, you'll have in your contract 9 to 5:30, Monday to Friday. Other contracts are not as specific, although your statement of terms and conditions that each employee has a right to have on starting employment should contain an hours of work clause, but you can have normal hours as much wider than that 9 to 5:30. So it looks good on paper. It might not be so good when it comes to implementation or an employee's right to enforce. Northern Ireland is not included in that legislation. In fact, Northern Ireland is not covered by the working time regulations either. I think it does its thing. But in the UK and Great Britain, Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland, there is as yet no right to disconnect. So, Dean, next slide, please. So whilst there is a health and safety element to this. So because in hand with this right to disconnect comes this issue about burnout, and individuals, they could love their job. They could absolutely, it's the best job they've ever had. And they could still burn out by not refusing work because they love the job so much. Or they could dislike the job and dislike it because of the hours that they have to work, and they could burn out. And that could lead to a personal injury claim against the organisation. We saw this coming. It had happened before. Oh my goodness, nothing's changed and it's happened again. And that would be a personal injury claim that the employee could raise against the organisation. But what can you do to get ahead of this curve? So let's not wait for the legislation. Let's see what we can do to ensure that we're protecting the health and safety of the workforce. And I've just listed there, targets and goals should be reasonably deliverable in normal working hours. Again, what are those normal working hours? Much like targets and goals for attaining a bonus or commission payments, make sure that they're achievable within the weeks of the year that the employee works. So take out the holiday time. This is a commission that an employee could earn based on that target in a year in which they take all their holidays and that they work a normal working day. The use of email footers to remind employees and third parties that email communication is not sought nor expected out of hours. Meetings shouldn't be regularly timetabled at unsociable hours. Employees should be empowered to manage their own working time appropriately, and employees should record their own working time so they know how much they're working. These are particularly 2 points, the last 2 points, for working from home individuals. And then the employer should be conscious of how they treat their colleagues. Everyone should. So how you are communicating with your colleagues, it sets a standard. If you're sending emails out, you can say at the end of it, I'm sending this because it suits me to send this at 11 p.m. I'm not expecting a reply. It's just 11 p.m. suits me. Be conscious of how you treat your colleagues and be respectful of the others to disconnect. So there's no attitude, somebody finishing at 5:30, that they're a part-timer, for want of a better phrase. That attitude should not be accepted within your organisation. And then recognise the exceptional circumstances, that there may be times when someone has to work out of these normal working hours because they are dealing with something that's happened abroad, and there's a different time zone, say in the US, and therefore they're working later in the evening. So have a recognition of those exceptional circumstances. So that was just a list so that you can ensure that there is this right to disconnect. I see Sarah's just mentioned on the chat line, if an employer employs someone for their UK organisation on a UK contract, but the person lives in France, would the employer have to comply with the local working time law? It's a good point. So your contract is providing for hours of work which are X and a salary which is X, but the mandatory working time regulations in the local jurisdiction will be mandatory, as I've said, the individual. I have to say that the individual, if they are going to, your jurisdictional clause in the contract will almost certainly refer to English law, the English courts. And that's where you would argue about the contractual point. And an individual bringing a mandatory 35 hours a week clause in the French system is unlikely, bearing in mind that they have signed a contract which says something very different, and it's their choice to sit in France, and that's their base through their choice, rather than the company putting them there as the company's choice. So I'd make sure in the contract that I'm emphasising it's the employee's choice, and therefore whilst there might be a mandatory law, it is English law and UK governing. I hadn't also reckoned on some big lorry. All you can tell, we are an urban employment law firm, but I apologise for the background noise, but I've enjoyed researching for this, so hopefully you can look at the slides and pick something up that you couldn't hear.
That's great. Thank you so much, and thank you for persevering with that. I think it's much worse for you than it is for us, but we get you really clearly.
Oh, it's all sort of beeping and all sorts going on.
That's all right. Yeah, and
at one point.
No pun intended. If anybody wants to construct a right to disconnect policy, we could definitely help you with that. And I think it'd be interesting to see which companies now will be trailblazers and will recognise this. It's something I'm actually very interested in doing. We do it anyway, but it's not formal as such. You know, there's no requirement you to work in crazy hours. Always wanted people to enjoy work and to enjoy their life at the same time as well. And yeah, I think it's a great thing because the cost of burnout is absolutely substantial. And something we covered on the last webinar we did, I believe, was just the cost of a resignation on average in the UK is £30,000 to an employer, which people don't really realise. And that's without any employment law claims, that's just simply somebody leaving. So if you get ahead of burnout, you will keep good people, you will save an absolute ton of money. And once again, if anybody needs a consultation about this or to have a chat about getting a brand spanking new right to disconnect policy, we can help you with that. And just checking the Q&A box, I think we're all clear. There's nothing in the chat left, is there? All that remains is for all of us to say thank you very much for attending. Really do appreciate you supporting us for this project. Everything that we've covered today is accurate as at 4 o'clock on the 17th of June 2021. There will be a recording of this webinar available going up on the website in the near future. And yeah, if anything else, do drop us a line. Okay, thanks for attending and have a great weekend when it comes. Okay, thanks.
Bye. Bye. Bye.